In Chapter 31, we will be discussing difficulties that some non-Western countries had after the Industrial Revolution began in Western Europe. Beginning in the early 1800s, four major empires, the Ottoman, Russian, Chinese, and Japanese, all found themselves confronted with some major problems. Compared to the rapidly improving militaries of Western European countries like Egypt, France, and Germany, the Ottoman, Russian, Chinese, and Japanese were quite weak. This military weakness made them more vulnerable to outside forces. They also suffered from internal weaknesses, including economic and financial problems due to the lack of industrialization, as well as government corruption. The Ottomans, Russians, Chinese, and Japanese all attempted to modernize. They all attempted to reform their government, education, and industry. These reforms were based on Western models. Although the degrees to which modernization occurred varied, most did not achieve any real success. The Ottoman Empire, Russia, and China were mostly unsuccessful in their attempts to modernize. As a result, by the end of the 19th century, their societies were on the verge of collapse. Reform in Japan was much more thorough, however, and Japan emerged as an industrial power in the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire reached its height during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the mid-1500s. The death of Suleiman, coupled with the military, commercial, and economic rise of Europe, checked the growth of the powerful Ottomans. The Ottomans started to fall behind Europe both economically and militarily. The military started to decline in the late 1600s. The power of its military fell behind Western Europe in strategic planning, as well as military tactics, weaponry, and training. The Janissary Corps, once the elite fighting force of the empire, became politically corrupt and undisciplined. Sultans were no longer able to keep order. Provisional governors gained power and raised private armies loyal not to the Sultan or to the Ottoman Empire, but to them. In the mid-1800s, the Ottomans suffered extensive territorial losses. Russians moved in the Caucasus region as well as Central Asia. The Austrians began to eat away at the empire's western frontiers. Greece and Serbia broke free from Ottoman rule. After Napoleon's failed campaign in 1798, Egypt gained autonomy. Egyptian general Muhammad Ali gained control of the region by building a powerful modern army. Were fearful of Ali's army and allowed him to rule Egypt as an autonomous province. Serious economic difficulties for the Ottomans began in the 17th century. In 1453, the Turks had conquered Constantinople and put a commercial stranglehold on Europeans looking to buy Asian goods. Although complete control of Euro-Asian trade benefited the Ottoman economy in the short term, the high prices they charged inspired the European age of exploration. By the 1800s, Europeans had almost completely bypassed Ottoman merchants. That, coupled with a greater European interest in the Atlantic Ocean trade, left the Ottoman economy on life support. The Ottomans tried to make money exporting raw materials like cotton, indigo, and opium. The income gained, however, was not enough to offset the cost of the manufactured goods they imported from Europe. As this trade deficit increased, so did the Ottomans' reliance on foreign loans from wealthy countries like Great Britain and France. As the borrowing increased, half of all Ottoman revenue went to pay the interest on the loans. Unable to pay back these loans, foreigners began to administer the debts of the Ottoman Empire by 1882. As the Ottomans racked up debt they couldn't pay back, it gave European lenders an excuse to gain control of the Middle Eastern Empire. Ottomans were forced to accept capitulations that allowed European lenders to control their economy. Europeans received extraterritoriality, which allowed them to operate freely in the Ottoman Empire, exempt from any laws in its borders. Europeans could operate businesses tax-free and could even levy their own duties in Ottoman ports. This left the best parts of the Ottoman economy to foreigners, depriving the Ottomans of desperately needed income, which left them even less capable of paying their debts. Ottoman rulers knew that reform was necessary for the survival of their empire. Attempts to reform and modernize the military were met with resistance by the elite Janissary Corps. As the most powerful and important part of the Ottoman military machine, it was the Janissaries who had the most to lose under a reform movement. As a result, they revolted in 1807 in an effort to retain their privileged position. After the revolt, a new sultan, Mahmud II, ascended to the throne. Mahmud was also a reformer. When the Janissaries again resisted reform, Mahmud had them massacred. Their removal cleared the way for much-needed reforms in the empire. Mahmud was able to build a European-style army as well as improve schools and roads. He even oversaw the construction of telegraph lines throughout the empire. At the end of his reign, Mahmud II launched a new set of legal and educational transformations which began a 40-year reform movement known as the Tazimat era. Beginning in 1839, sultans sought sweeping changes to restructure and strengthen a decaying Ottoman state. These legal reforms were modeled after Napoleon's Civil Code, the law system that had permeated Western Europe since the early 1800s. In 1846, the Ottoman began to reform their educational system. By 1869, they had established compulsory primary education throughout the empire. The big losers during these reforms were the religious leaders. The power of the ulama was weakened at the expense of the state. Although reform and reorganization strengthened Ottoman society, the Tazimat provoked opposition from several different groups. Harsh criticism came from religious conservatives, who argued that the reformers posed a threat to the empire's Islamic foundation. Many devout Muslims viewed the extension of legal equality to Jews and Christians as an act contrary to the basic principles of Islamic law. Even some minority leaders opposed legal equality, fearing it would diminish their own position as intermediaries between their communities and the Ottoman state. Criticism arose not only from conservatives, but liberals who wanted reform further. Criticism arose not only from conservatives, but liberals who wanted reform to go even further. A group known as the Young Ottomans agitated for individual freedom, local autonomy, and political decentralization. Many young Ottomans desired the establishment of a constitutional government along the lines of the British system. High-level bureaucrats also opposed the Tazimat reforms. They wanted more influence in an effort to check the power of the sultans. The end of the Tazimat era led to political instability that eventually culminated in the rise of the Young Turks. The late 1800s saw cycles of reform and repression. In 1876, a group of radical dissidents from the Ottoman bureaucracy that wanted a constitutional government seized power in a coup. They installed Abdul Hamid II as Sultan. Convinced of the need to check the Sultan's power, reformers persuaded Abdul Hamid to accept a constitution that limited his authority and established a representative government. Within a year, however, the Sultan suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, exiled many liberals, and executed others. For 30 years, he ruled autocratically in an effort to rescue the empire from dismemberment by European powers. He continued to develop the army and administration, and oversaw the formation of a police force, educational reforms, economic development, and the construction of the railroads. Though intended to strengthen the state, Abdul's reforms actually undermined the position of the Sultan. As Ottoman bureaucrats and army officers received a European education, they not only learned modern science and technology, but also became acquainted with European political, social, and cultural traditions. Educated subjects came to believe that the biggest problem of the Ottoman Empire was the political structure that vested unchecked power in the Sultan. The most active dissident organization was the Young Turk Party. Founded in 1889 by exiled Ottoman subjects living in Paris, the Young Turk Party vigorously promoted reform. Young Turks called for universal suffrage, equality before the law, freedom of religion, free public education, secularization of the state, and the emancipation of women. In 1908, the Young Turks inspired an army coup that forced Abdul Hamid to restore parliament and the Constitution of 1876. In 1909, they dethroned him and installed a puppet sultan. For the next decade, Ottoman sultans reigned, but no longer ruled. The nationalistic Young Turks worked to make Turkish the official language of the empire, even though many subjects spoke Arabic or a Slavic language as their native tongue. This and other pro-Turkish policies led to Arab resistance in the south. In spite of their efforts to shore up the ailing empire, reformers could not turn the tide of decline. Ottoman armies continued to lose wars, and subject peoples continued to seek autonomy or independence. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire survived principally because European diplomats could not agree on how to dispose of the empire without upsetting the European balance of power.